Before Mass begins, the server must dress the altar in preparation. He first removes the cover from the altar. He places the altar cards in their proper positions, the center card in the center, the lavabo card on the epistle side, and the last gospel card on the gospel side. He lights the candles, which at low Mass are only two. First the epistle side, then the gospel side. On the credence table, there should be cruets containing water and wine for Mass, a lavabo dish and towel, a bell for the server to ring during Mass, and if communion is to be distributed to the faithful, a server's paten. The altar missal is placed on a missal stand, which is set square on the epistle side of the altar. The missal should be placed on the altar closed, with the pages facing towards the center of the altar. Prior to placing the missal on the altar, the priest should read through all the prayers proper to the Mass of the day. He should also set the ribbons to their appropriate places. The first ribbon should be placed at the Introit of the Mass. If the Introit comes from one of the commons, a second ribbon must be placed for the proper collect, secret, and post-communion. The last ribbon is placed at the appropriate preface. If in doubt about which Mass is to be said on a given day, check the liturgical ordo for the year. The altar is now dressed and ready for Mass. Prior to saying Mass, the priest should spend a little time in prayer to properly recollect himself. There are a number of prayers in the front of the altar missal which are provided for this purpose. The priest then goes to the sacristy to vest for Mass. The vestments should be laid out in the sacristy before Mass in the opposite order in which they are put on. First the chasuble, then the stole, then the maniple, the cincture, the alb, and the amice. When the priest enters the sacristy to begin vesting, he first washes his hands. While washing his hands, he says the prayer,
Da Domine, virtutum manibus meis, ad abstrugendum omnem maculam, ut sine polluti alimentis et corporis variam tibi servire.
The priest then approaches the vesting table. He should be clothed in black shoes and cassock and remove his watch and any other jewelry. He may also remove his fascia. The priest then prepares the chalice for Mass. The cross at the base of the chalice should be facing forward. If the chalice does not have a cross, the priest should note some image or marking on the chalice as a reference point. This is so that the same side of the chalice will always be used when pouring in the water and wine and when drinking the precious blood and the ablutions. The purificator is laid over the top of the chalice, with the cross in the center and the ends draped over each side. The paten is laid on top of the purificator, with a large host placed in the center. The pall covers the paten. The chalice veil is then draped over the whole chalice so that the front part of the chalice is completely veiled. Usually, there will be a decorative design on the front of the chalice veil, which should face forward. The corporal should have been folded and ironed previously in the following manner. The corporal is first folded into thirds, the bottom third folded up and the top third down. Then in thirds again, first the right side and then the left. The folded corporal is then placed inside the burse with the open ends facing out. The burse is laid on top of the chalice, with the closed fold towards the front and the open end towards the back. Each of the vestments has a prayer which is proper to it, and the priest should say this prayer as he puts on each of the vestments. He begins with the amice, taking it by the cords, and kissing the cross in the center. He then draws his right hand over his head, touches the amice to his head briefly, and begins the prayer.
Impone Domine capiti meo gallium salutis, ad expugniandos diabarucus incursus.
He wraps the amice around his neck so that the collar is completely covered. He crosses the right cord over the left, draws them around his back, and ties them in front. He tucks in the edges of the amice as necessary to cover the collar. He next takes the alb as he begins the prayer.
De alba me Domine et munde cor meum, ut in sanguine agni dealbatus gaudius perfuar sempiternis.
He first puts in the right sleeve, followed by the left. The server may assist the priest to make sure the alb falls evenly at his feet. It should cover the cassock completely and hang within a few inches of the floor. The server then presents the cincture, which the priest takes in both hands, and girds himself as he says the prayer.
Praecinge me Domine cinguru puritatis, et extingue in lumbis meis, humorum libidinis, ut maniat in me virtus continensit castitatis.
He makes a knot in front and pulls it tight, leaving the ends hanging at the middle. He then checks to make sure the alb hangs evenly all the way around. The priest then takes the maniple, kisses the cross in the center, and puts it on his left arm as he says the prayer.
Mariare Domine, portare manipulum fletus et dolores, ut cum exultatione recipiam mercedam laboris.
The maniple should be placed on the forearm towards the elbow, but not further. It is secured either with an elastic band or, more traditionally, with a maniple pin. The priest then takes the stole and kisses the cross in the center as he begins the prayer.
Redi mihi Domine solum immortalitatis quam perdidi in prevaricatione primi parentis, et quam vis indinius acceduat tuum sacrum mysterium meria tamen gaudium sempiternum.
He places it over his neck with the cross at the center. He then crosses the ends in front, right over left. He secures each end with the cincture, making 2 loops on either side, through which he then puts the ends of the cincture, allowing them to hang on either side. The priest then puts on the chasuble, assisted by the server. As he puts his head through, he says the prayer.
Domine quid existi, iugum meum suave est donus meum leve, fac ut istut portare sigvariam, quod consequar tuam gratiam. Amen.
Once the priest is fully vested, he picks up the chalice with his left hand and turns it so that the veiled side is facing away from him. He takes his biretta and covers his head, making sure the middle fin is towards his right. He then places his right hand on top of the burse to steady the chalice. The priest and server both bow their heads to the cross in the sacristy and then proceed to the altar. The server may give the priest holy water at the entrance to the chapel. It is also customary for the server to ring a bell as they enter to alert the people that Mass is beginning. They then proceed to the altar. The priest processes to the altar preceded by the server. If he should pass a tabernacle where the Blessed Sacrament is reserved, both priest and server turn and genuflect to the Blessed Sacrament. Since the priest is carrying the chalice, he does not uncover his head while genuflecting. When the priest arrives at the foot of the altar where he is to say Mass, he uncovers and gives the biretta to the server who stands on his right. Both then reverence the altar. If the Blessed Sacrament is reserved in a tabernacle on or immediately behind the altar, the priest genuflects on the floor. If the Blessed Sacrament is not present, the priest makes a profound bow. The server, however, always genuflex. The priest then ascends the altar. The server assists by lifting the hem of his alb and cassock. When the priest arrives at the altar, he places the chalice towards the gospel side, turning it so that the veiled side faces towards him. He takes the burse with both hands, and then removes the corporal with his right hand and places it on the center of the altar in front of him. He then takes the burse with the right hand and sets the burse on the gospel side. The priest then unfolds the corporal with both hands. He arranges the corporal so that the near edge of the corporal is about an inch from the edge of the altar. He then takes the chalice with the left hand and sets it on the center of the corporal, but far enough back to leave him room to kiss the altar later. He then folds his hands before the breast, turns, and goes to the missal. At the missal, he opens the book with both hands and checks the ribbons to make sure they are set correctly for the Mass. He leaves the missal open to the page containing the Introit, joins his hands, and goes to the center of the altar. He makes a low head bow to the altar cross, and then turns by his right to descend. As he turns, he steps a little to his left, so as not to turn his back completely to the altar. When he arrives at the foot of the altar, he again reverences the altar. If the Blessed Sacrament is present, he genuflects, although this genuflection will not be on the floor, but against the first step. If the Blessed Sacrament is not present, he bows profoundly. The priest and server then begin the prayers at the foot of the altar. The priest begins the prayers at the foot of the altar with the sign of the cross as he says the words,
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
The priest recites the whole of Psalm 42, alternating with the server. He holds his hands joined at the breast. All of the prayers at the foot of the altar are said in the loud voice.
Emite lutum tuum et veritatem tuum, ipsime deduxerunt et aduxerunt in mantem sanctum tuum et in tabernacula tuum.
Et intribo auditare Dei ad Deum crucificati ventutem meam.
Confitebo tibi incitera Deus meus, quare trisus anima mea et quare conturbas me.
At the Gloria Patri, the priest makes a low head bow.
Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto.
Sicut erat in principio nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
The priest makes the sign of the cross as he says,
Adiutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.
Qui fecit caelum et terram.
He then bows profoundly and begins the Confiteor. When bowed, he should make sure to keep his hands joined at the breast with fingers pointed upward toward heaven. At the words,
Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa.
He strikes his breast 3 times with the right hand, keeping his fingers extended as he does so. The priest remains bowed while the server makes the response.
Misereatur tui omnipotens, Deus de missis peccatis tuis purgata.
The priest answers
Amen.
and stands erect while the server says his Confiteor.
Beatum Michaeli Arcangelo, Beatum non Baptiste, Sanctus Apostolis Petro Paulo omnibus sanctis et tibi pater, qui beccavi nimis cogitatione verbro d'opere, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, ideo precor Beata Mariam semper Virginam, Beatum Michaelum Arcangelum, Beatum non Baptistam, Sanctos Apostolos Petrum Paulum, omnes sanctos et te pater, orare pro me ad Dominum Deum nostrum.
Miseriatur vestri omnipotens Deus, dimissis peccatis
He then makes the sign of the cross.
Amen.
Indulgentiam absolutionem et remissionem peccatorum nostrorum, tubat nobis omnipotens et misericors Domini.
Amen.
The priest makes a medium bow of the body for the last 4 versicles, keeping his hands joined at the breast.
Et salutare tuum da nobis,
Domini exaudi orationem meam.
et clamor meus ad te veni.
He opens and closes his hands as he says,
Oremus.
and then straightens and ascends the altar. After the priest finishes the prayers at the foot of the altar, he immediately ascends the altar while saying the prayer, Alphara Nobis, in the quiet voice. He should finish the prayer at the same time as he arrives at the altar. He then immediately makes a medium bow of the body and places his hands joined on the altar as he begins the prayer, Oramus te Domine, also in the quiet voice. At the words Quorum relique hic sunt, he places both hands flat on the altar outside the corporal, bends straight down, and kisses the altar in the center. He then stands erect, joins his hands at the breast, turns, and goes to the missal, finishing the prayer as he does so. He turns to face the missal squarely and begins the Introit. The Introit is the first of the proper prayers of the Mass. It consists of an antiphon, followed by a psalm verse, then the Gloria Patri, and then a repetition of the antiphon. The priest makes the sign of the cross as he begins the first words.
Nos autem gloriare portet in cruce Domini nostri Iesu Christi, in quo est salus vitae et resurrectio nostra, perquam salvator.
The Introit is said in the loud voice, with the hands joined at the breast.
Illuminat vultum suum super nos et misereatur nostri.
At the Gloria Patri, the priest makes a low head bow,
In principio et nunc et semper in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
and then repeats the antiphon up to, but not including, the psalm verse.
In quo est salus vitae et resurrectio nostra.
After he finishes the Introit, he turns and goes to the center to say the Kyrie. When the priest has finished the Introit, he turns and goes to the center of the altar. He then recites the Kyrie with the server. The Kyrie is comprised of 9 alternating verses: 3 recitations of the Kyrie eleison, 3 recitations of the Christe eleison, and 3 more recitations of the Kyrie eleison. The priest begins each set of Kyries, the server begins the Christes.
Kyrie eleison.
Kyrie eleison.
Kyrie eleison.
Christe eleison.
Christe eleison.
Christe eleison.
Kyrie eleison.
Kyrie eleison.
Kyrie eleison. Gloria in excelsis Deo, et in terra pax hominibus bone voluntatis.
After the Kyrie, the priest then begins the Gloria.
Adoramus te, glorificamus.
The Gloria is not said at every Mass, but occurs on most first, second, and third class feasts which are not penitential. As he says the first verse of the Gloria, he separates and elevates his hands in a small circle, making sure he doesn't raise or extend them beyond his shoulders. He makes a low head bow at the word Deo. He recites the entire Gloria in the loud voice with hands joined at the breast. He makes a low head bow to the cross at the words Adoramus te, Gratias agimus tibi, both times at the Holy Name, and at the Suscipe deprecationem nostram. At the last verse, the priest makes the sign of the cross.
Gloria in excelsis Deo, et in terra pax hominibus bone voluntatis, laudamus te, benedicimus te, adoramus te, glorificamus te, gratias agimus tibi propter magnum gloriam tuam. Domine Deus rex celestis Deus Pater omnipotens, Domine Fili unigenite Iesu Christe, Domine Deus agnus Dei Filius Patris, qui todis peccata mundi miserere nobis, qui todis peccata mundi suscipe deprecationem nostram, qui sedis ad dexteram Patris miserere nobis, quoniam tu sodus sanctus, tu sodus Dominus, tu sodus Altissimus Iesu Christe, cum Sancto Spiritu, in gloria Dei Patris. Amen.
After he finishes making the sign of the cross, he immediately places both hands flat on the altar outside the corporal and kisses the altar. He turns around to face the people, keeping his eyes cast down, and says,
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
He then goes to the Missal to say the Collect.
Oremus.
After the Gloria, the priest says the Collect of the Mass.
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Oremus. Deus qui nos hodie
The Collect, also called the Oratio, comes from the propers for the Mass of the day. It begins with an Oremus, which is said while making a low head bow, and finishes with a conclusion. The conclusion will differ according to the text of the prayer. As soon as the priest arrives at the missal, he separates and rejoins his hands as he makes a low head bow and says,
Oremus.
He then extends his hands for the prayer.
Deus qui nos hodie die exertationis
He says the entire collect with hands extended in a loud voice. At the end of the prayer, he joins his hands and says the conclusion.
Periundum Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum Filium Tuum, qui tecum vivit et regnat in unitate Spiritus Sancti Deus, per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
There are three possible conclusions to the collect prayer. The most common conclusion is Per Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum Filium Tuum, qui tecum vivit et regnat in unitate Spiritus Sancti Deus, per omnia saecula saeculorum. If this conclusion is to be said, the priest joins his hands as he begins the conclusion and makes a low head bow when he mentions the holy name. The second conclusion is Qui vivis et regnas cum Deo Patre in unitate Spiritus Sancti Deus, per omnia saecula saeculorum. The third conclusion is Qui tecum vivit et regnat in unitate Spiritus Sancti Deus, per omnia saecula saeculorum. Since these last two conclusions do not contain the holy name, the priest does not bow his head while saying these conclusions. These three conclusions must be memorized, since the missal will not contain the entire text of the conclusion, but simply indicate which conclusion to use by printing only the first 2 or 3 words of the conclusion after the text of the prayer.
Eius redemptionis premii in caelo meriamur, periundum Dominum nostrum Iesum Christum Filium Tuum, qui tecum vivit et regnat in unitate.
At the end of the conclusion, the server responds,
Amen.
The priest then immediately begins the epistle. The epistle is said in the loud tone, with hands placed on the missal. If the holy name is mentioned in the epistle, the priest makes a low head bow.
Quod est in Christo Iesum, qui cum in forma Dei esset non rapinam, habitatus est esse se equalum Deo.
If he must make a genuflection while reading, he places his hands on the altar and genuflects at the place marked in the text.
Propter corde Deus exaltavit idum, et donavit iri nomen, corde super omne nomen, ut in nomine Iesu, omne genuflectatur.
At the end of the epistle, he signals the server to respond by laying his left hand on the altar or by nodding his head.
Deo gratias.
After the epistle, there are a number of prayers in succession which will vary depending on the season. For most of the year, there will be a gradual followed by an Alleluia verse. During the season of Septuagesima and Lent, and for vigils, the Alleluia is replaced with a tract. During Paschal time, the gradual is replaced with an extra Alleluia verse. And on 6 special feast days during the year, there will be, in addition to these prayers, a sequence. The prayers which follow the epistle will always be clearly marked in the missal. They are read in the loud tone, with hands placed on the book.
Alleluia, alleluia. Dulce dignum, dulces clavus, dulce afferens pondere. Queso refuisti digna.
When he finishes the last prayer, he joins his hands and goes to the center to begin the prayers before the gospel. When the priest finishes the last prayer after the epistle, he joins his hands and goes to the center of the altar. The server, meanwhile, transfers the missal. At the center of the altar, the priest first lifts his eyes up to the cross. He then makes a profound bow over the altar, keeping his hands joined at the breast. He now recites the Munda Cor Meum in the quiet voice, followed immediately by the Iube Domine Benedicere and the Dominus Sit in Corde Meo. The priest then straightens, turns, and goes to the missal on the gospel side. He faces the missal, standing at an angle to the altar, and with joined hands says in the loud voice,
Dominus vobiscum.
He then signs the gospel text by placing his left hand flat on the missal, while the right thumb makes a small sign of the cross on the first few words of the text of the gospel itself. He places his left hand on his breast and makes 3 small signs of the cross on himself, first the forehead, then lips and breast. These signs of the cross are made as he says the words,
Sequentia Sancti Evangelii secundum Ioannem.
Gloria tibi, Domine.
In illo tempore dixit Iesus turbis Iudeorum, nunc edicium est mundi, nunc princeps huius mundi ediciet foras. Regos di exaltatus fuero et terra, omnia traham ad me ipsum. Hoc autem dicebat significans quam morte esse moriturus. Respondit ei turbas. Nos adivimus
The Gospel is read in the loud voice with hands joined at the breast. If the holy name is mentioned, the priest makes a low head bow towards the missal.
Dixit ergo eis Iesus, ad hoc modicum lumen in vobis est, ambulante dum lumciam habetis, ut non vos tenebrae comprehendant. Et qui ambulat in tenebris
At the conclusion of the Gospel, the priest lifts the book and kisses the place where he signed it, as he says in the quiet voice, Per evangelica dicta deleantur nostra delicta. The server responds.
Laus tibi, Christe.
The priest then moves both book and missal stand to the center. The missal should be placed at a comfortable angle for the priest to read the offertory and prayers of the canon. It should be close to, but not resting on, the corporal. He then begins the creed.
Credo in unum Deum, Patrum omnipotentem, factorem caeli et
The creed is always said on Sundays and first-class feasts. With the exception of some second-class feasts, it usually does not occur during weekday masses. The liturgical ordo will always tell you when a creed is to be said. At the first verse, the priest elevates his hands in a small circle in the same manner as he did at the Gloria, and makes a low head bow at the word Deum. He recites the creed in the loud voice with hands joined at the breast. He makes a low head bow at the holy name and the simul adoratur. At the verse Et incarnatus est de Spiritu Sancto ex Maria Virgine et homo factus est, he genuflects with his hands on the altar. At the last verse, the priest makes the sign of the cross.
Credo in unum Deum, Patrum omnipotentem, factorem caeli et terrae, visibilium omnium et invisibilium, et in unum Dominum Iesum Christum, Filium Dei unigenitum, et ex parte natum ante omnia secula, Deum de Deo, lumen de lumine, Deum verum de Deo vero, genitum non factum consubstantialem Patri, perquem omnia facta sunt, qui propter nos homines et propter nostrum salutem, descendit de celis, et incarnatus est de Spiritu Sancto ex Maria Virgine, et homo factus est. Crucifixus etiam pro nobis sub Pontio Pilato, passus et sepultus est, et resurrexit tertia die secundum Scripturas, et ascendit in caelum sedet ad dexteram Patris, et iterum venturus est cum gloria judicare vivos et mortuos, cuius regni non et finis, et in Spiritum Sanctum Dominum et vivificantem, qui ex Patre Filioque procedit, qui cum Patre et Filio simo adorator et conglorificator, qui locutus est per prophetas, et unam sanctum catholicam et apostolicae ecclesiam, confitior unum baptismum and remissionem peccatorum, et expecto resurrectionem mortuorum, et vitam venturi securi. Amen.
When he finishes the creed, he immediately places both hands flat on the altar outside the corporal and kisses the altar. He turns around to face the people, separates and rejoins his hands as he says,
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu
He turns
tuo.
back around the same way, separates and rejoins his hands as he makes a low head bow to the cross and says,
Oremus.
He then begins the offertory antiphon in the loud voice.
Levem tuum per signium sancti crucis.